I think that just goes to the moral of the story that sometimes a closed door isn't entirely closed. It's not always closed. Anyways, okay. So now we're going to be talking about not always will you have a neat and tidy whole body present. Sometimes, you'll be going to the science center. Like, for example, I remember going to the science center as a kid. And as one of the exhibits that they would hand out to us, where we could actually feel were these old desiccated lungs from a person's body. And they would give you the lung from a person who was healthy, a non-smoker, and then they would show you the lung of a smoker, and you could see how black and how decrepit and how awful it was, even though these people were both in their 30s. And they would be handing this thing around, and you could feel the lung. I remember feeling this lung. So it's not always do you have a neat and tidy body present. What are the parameters when it comes to a not whole, complete body? Sometimes, for example, somebody we're working in a laboratory, and there'll be all sorts of samples that are present. Sometimes there are bits of body pieces that are around. How do we reckon with that? What presents itself as a problem? What is not a problem? And again, we're not talking about a doctor who's studying in order to become a medical professional who has to negotiate life and death situations, whose entire role in his employment is to save people's lives. We're not talking about that. We're talking about you and I going to that science center. What are our obligations there? Um, you know, or when I'm going into a laboratory. I remember going to see my father's laboratories on occasions. There were times when he would be working for universities, and the laboratories had all sorts of interesting things, and I would come to visit him at his place of work. When I was in high school, I used to take Toronto public transit, which was fantastic. I used to be able to get anywhere in the city I needed to go, and I would be able just to go wherever he was and just come like if I had the afternoon off from yeshiva, I would just go and so say hello, take a friend of mine with me, and we go and visit him. And we all sorts of interesting things to see into some of those laboratories. What are the considerations that one would have to have had they been a Kohen or had I been a Kohen? So let's take a look. We're again on page 31. So a mace or a corpse, I like to use the word deceased because it's a little bit cleaner. So the body of a deceased human is metame ba'ohel, meaning the body itself, without just getting involved in the nitty-gritty details about body pieces and parts. If you're in a morgue, if you're in a Lechaver Kadisha room performing a tahara, if a Kohen should not be in that room because the mace, while he's there, the deceased, while they're there, is generating an impurity, a tuma that is manifest all around by just simply being in the same shelter. Now, one of the most difficult parts of my job in Milwaukee, being the rabbi of a congregation, was that my shul was about maybe a kilometer away from the hospital. It was closer than Rocky View is, and there was no other shul close by. And our congregation had a relationship with that synagogue. And whenever the chaplain would encounter a young Jewish couple who were not affiliated, because I was a volunteer at the hospital, I would get a phone call saying, "Hey, there's a young couple here could really use some guidance." And I remember once visiting a couple. They had recently moved to Milwaukee. They were completely unaffiliated. They moved from the East Coast, I think someplace around Philadelphia. Um, and she had just had a miscarriage, where there was an actual fetus. It was several months old, dealing with an actual baby. And they did not know what to do with it. So what do you do with a fetus? A fetus requires kavura also. You bury the fetus. As long as it looks like a human being, as long as has arms, legs, and a head, and a torso, you bury it in the cemetery. So I remember dealing with this very distraught couple, um, going down to the laboratory part of the building because they generally incinerate fetuses. They don't generally give them to, they don't generally bring them over to funeral homes. And they handed me this fetus in a cardboard box, like a mailing box, like an Amazon box. The kids were off from school. My wife was not working, so I had all the children with me, and they're in the car. with this box. Didn't tell them what it was. Um, I had to wait. I couldn't bring it to the cemetery until my wife came home. And I had the box with me in the house. It's a little baby. It was a very difficult time for everybody involved. Um, but at the same time, it's also those are those difficult times are also the most meaningful times when you're actually there to be s- to actually be of utility, help, and play a role in somebody's life in a meaningful, positive way. And I'm still in touch with that young couple. They're still not affiliated, but I'm still in touch with them. It was, but that baby that was probably about 4 or 5 months along in its development required burial. You actually, not only that, you also perform a bris milah, you perform a circumcision. Um, yeah, we say that baby also generates that same level of impurity. The baby is a baby regardless of its state of development. It's still a human being, and it still also will generate that impurity provided, he says, it is at least 40 days from conception. As long as it's 40 days from conception, that is when that's this that Nephil, that baby, that even the stillbirth is that will be is able to generate that level of impurity. A fetus, he says, is mitame. It's able to generate that impurity, even though it may not be fully formed and does not have an olive. It's not even does not even have an olive-sized volume to it. It doesn't have an olive-sized amount of flesh on it. It's as long as it's a whole item, it is able to generate that impurity. And that is, and I just need to do something with my screen here. Um, um, oh, come on, pen. There we go. Okay.
You couldn't do it, you wouldn't do it, or you would have waited for another rabbi.
I would have seen if I could have gotten another rabbi involved. If I couldn't, then I would have done the exact same thing because that's what that's just it would be a mace mitzvah in that case. If I could not get anyone else to handle this, that would be the quintessential mace mitzvah, the body that has nobody to take care of it. Because the other alternative was incineration, and we don't do that. We bury babies. We bury everyone. We don't want. It's kind of hard to say. It's kind of, language fails me. Sorry. We will even in a situation such as this, we will bury the infant. All right. So next, we're turning the page 32. A kazayas, which is an olive-sized amount of flesh from a deceased body, is also matami ba'ohel. So that would mean, for example, should someone, should there be some kind of an autopsy being performed and a sample is taken off of the body and brought to that laboratory where my father, the biologist, was working, that could have potentially also been problematic. This is so even if the flesh has been completely dried out, completely desiccated. So that would be comparable to that lung that I told you about as a kid at the science center, and they were handing out these lungs for us to feel and to pass along and to touch. Um, Even though it was completely desiccated, as long as there was an olive-sized amount of mass, that would be adequate for it to be problematic. It would be generating an impurity. And I'm trying to remember, it's possible that the Kohanim in my school, the kids anyways, did not go to the science center with us because of that problem, because of those things that were being done at the science center that I mentioned. And he says, even if the kezias, this olive-sized amount of flesh, is cut in half, it's considered joined if they're in the same room. So if you have that lung and it wasn't a full olive-sized portion and it was cut into two parts, even though neither one of them is the size of an olive, conglomerately they would be the size of an olive. As long as they're in the same room, there we join them together for the purposes of generating an impurity, right? Because it's there. You have these they're all share it's all sharing the same roof. It's hard to separate them and say they're not the same thing or that they're too small, each one independently, when they were originally part of the same thing and they're under the same roof. They're, why should we view them as separate if the entire area is considered to be joined, at least as for the purposes of generating and spreading impurity goes, at least so therefore, even if they've been separated, as long as they're in the same room, we consider them to be together, to be joined, and the impurity is also generated. Okay, we continue. Two pieces of flesh from two separate individuals also form a kezias. So again, as long as you have that olive-sized portion of flesh that you can join together, that's enough for that impurity to be generated, creating a problem, creating a challenge for a Kohen. He says also further, flesh that has decomposed so that it is in a state similar to that to a gel is called netzel and is also capable of generating an impurity. Even though it's a liquid, even though the body's decomposed, it still has the ability to generate that impurity. So we actually had a case like this in Allentown, where a member of our congregation we lost touch with. He wasn't answering phone calls or anything of the sort, and we just didn't think anything of it. We thought maybe he just like skipped town, went to Florida or something. But it turns out that we found notices for asking for next of kin for so and so to please come and claim the body, and it turns out that this person had passed away, was in their home, it was in a bathtub, in fact, and had begun decomposing to the degree that they had actually, they had liquefied to a degree. So I had to deal with the quite halakha questions of, do you bury the bathtub because it has the liquid stuff in it. I don't remember what the answer was. I don't think we did, but I do remember this being a discussion in that case. But yes, bodies do decompose, and as much as we don't like to think about it, sometimes rabbis get dragged into having to negotiate some of those circumstances and situations. Yes, bodies do decompose, and you have to deal with the fallout, and the liquid could potentially be a problem. So if you're a police officer or a peace officer who has to go into that kind of an environment, perhaps you should ask your partner to check it out first, depending on the circumstances, depending on the situation. Okay, now a complete limb, regardless of size, whether from the deceased or detached even from a live person, is also capable of generating that impurity. So if somebody has to have their leg amputated, somebody was a victim of the Civil War and they didn't have better medical technology. I watched Dances with Wolves just like everybody else. And you remember the person, I think it was, I remember the main character had to have part of their leg amputated. They got shot in the leg. I think my father, I was explaining this to my children, and my father happened to be in the room and says, yeah, that's why surgeons are called bone cutters, something along those lines. Which is a term that I do not recall ever hearing.
Sawbones.
Sawbones, is that okay? Excuse me, sawbones. Okay. Yes, sawbones. Okay, was that you, Mel, who was correcting me?
No,
No? All right, well, one of you was Sean or Mrs. Gluck. One of you was correcting me saying sawbones. Yes. Milton's saying sawbones too. Sawbones, yes. Um, but even if it's from a live person, it still is capable of generating an impurity. A Kohen who finds himself having to get that amputation, he's allowed to get that amputation. Don't think to himself, "Oh, I can't get myself amputated if I have I suffer from diabetes, I have a gangrenous leg, I can't get it amputated. I'll be in the room with a portion of my body." Don't think that way. You do what you need to do to save your life, to protect your health, even if it means saving other parts of your body, even if it's not life-threatening. You still do what you need to do in order to ensure that you're healthy. You take good medical care of yourself. But the amputated limb of a whole amputated limb is still also capable of generating that impurity. Now, the Mishnah counts 258 limbs in a person. Limbs may be a bit of a misnomer, rather body parts. The Mishnah counts 248 of them. It's these limbs that are the ones that are able to generate the impurity. A limb has to have three component parts to it. It has to have basar, which is muscle tissue. It has to have gidin, which are, if you take a look at footnote number 135, it's a generic term for any stringy part or cord of a person or animal. It's not easily eaten. The included are arteries, veins, tendons, ligaments, and nerves, and atzomus, as well as bones. It needs to have these three things in order to be considered a limb. Does anyone think of a body part that doesn't have any of these component parts? Yeah, so read ahead. Go ahead, cheat. Right.
I missed it, what you said?
Internal organs, liver, spleen, tongue, or eyes are not included because they don't have all these other parts to them. They don't have bones, they don't have sinews, and but some of them, perhaps eyes, also do not have muscle tissue. It's not considered a limb, and therefore it's not able to generate an impurity. Not only that, but we said in order for the limb to be metame ba'ohel, in order for it to generate impurity, it must have enough flesh still attached that had it still been attached to the body, it would have healed. So it's difficult to imagine the circumstance of the situation, but there still has to be some bits to it. You can't just like when you think, for example, of that chicken bone when you hold it up, the drumstick that has all that how that meaty tissue on it. It has to have a lot of the meaty tissue on it. If it's just a little bit of meaty tissue, it's not enough, and it will not generate impurity. Now, remember, this sounds rather morbid and it all sounds rather extreme. But remember, you encounter situations like this, or at least I've encountered situations like this, with some frequency, either because I had to visit laboratories or visiting my father, or I went to the science center. And you'd be surprised what actually you can find in museums and in science centers, what are in jars that are on display often, bits of human bodies and stuff like that. It is surprisingly everywhere. You just are not necessarily tracking and not necessarily aware of it.
I went into my brother's lab. My brother's an orthopedic surgeon.
Yeah.
Who did research. Went into my brother's lab. I don't know, no big deal. Opens a fridge filled with human bones.
Human bones, yeah. Yes.
Oh no.
Right.
So my brother's a Kohen too, right?
Yeah, but
he's got a different program.
Yes, you're dealing with a completely different animal. We're talking about those of us who are retired, or like I don't know, like we're tow truck drivers, or we're real estate agents. We don't have to negotiate the life and death scenarios that doctors do. Yes, absolutely. Okay, now we continue. Bones. Now, when it comes to bones, there is a prerequisite amount, which is a quarter kav. A kav is a measure, it's a weight. Offhand, I don't know what it is. But if you have a quarter kav of bones, which is a certain measure, a certain weight, it's able to generate an impurity. Bones that are the majority of the form of the skeleton, which is a halachic term that we use, rov binyan, or the majority of the bones in a skeleton, which is just the majority of number, they're also able to generate the impurity, even if you don't have the prerequisite weight. As long as you have the majority of the body, or you have the majority of the number of bones, it's enough to have those and be able to generate an impurity again, and that would be comparable to the situation that Milton was describing visiting his brother's laboratory, where you would open up the refrigerator and them bones were there. Them bones. This is even
Rabbi, so the amputated leg gets into the fridge. What do you do with the amputated leg?
It should be
the option of being on the fridge.
So if you were to ask a rabbi, what do you do with an amputated bone? You bury it in the cemetery. It gets buried. It's treated. We treat all parts of the human body with a level of reverence. It's all components of what we consider to be the tzelem Elokim. The beings created in the image of God. Go ahead.
Only that the parts that are considered to be which generate.
That's generally true. Ooh, that's a good question. You probably would not bury liver, but I don't know offhand. I really don't know if you would bury a liver. But I know. I had to ask a question. Hannah was regretfully had some medical challenges when we lived in Milwaukee. She had a epidermoid cyst in her brain, which is a skin tag that just grew and grew and grew, and eventually it started pushing her brain around. She started having seizures, so she had to have what I call open head surgery. They had to move this fist-sized mass from her skull, and she still has a space in there from where this cyst grew and developed over the course of 25, 30 years. I asked the question, does the tumor have to be buried? The answer was no, it's a tumor. Get your tonsils out. You don't have to bury your tonsils. That's right. Tumors are not tummy, right? Well, remember, we're gonna see something else also. But but if you recall, it has to have bones, sinew, and not muscular. It has to have muscular tissue. It has to have muscular tissue in order for it to be considered an aver, which would generate an impurity. I'd have to ask a question about livers, whether or not they have to be buried if it gets removed. You might be right that it's entirely sort of hand in hand with impurity and whether it generates impurity. It's a fascinating question, and thank you for raising it. Okay. Bones or a bone smaller than a quarter kav do not generate an impurity through sharing the same roof, but remain tameh b'maga and masa, which means you can become impure by touching them or moving them until they become the size smaller than a barley kernel. So something that's less than a barley kernel does not generate impurity. Now, where does this come up? Anyone want to venture a guess as to where bits of bone that's the size of a barley kernel actually comes up practically?
Well, all the explosions, all the terrible bombings that happened in Israel, a catastrophe of any kind.
Well, generally, we do still find the bodies. It's not like the World Trade Center where you have an entire skyscraper falling, which completely pulverizes the body. Generally, you find larger parts of the body in those kinds of accidents. You find it after cremation. There are bits of bone that size after cremation. We'll see. There's actually the author here, Rabbi Melchek, actually includes pictures so you can actually see it. And that's actually where it becomes perhaps problematic. So if a Kohen probably shouldn't pick up a vial or whatever they call an urn that contains one's great uncle or their neighbor's great uncle, because there still might be bits of bone the size of a barley kernel in the urn itself.
Wouldn't be advisable for according to Auschwitz.
That's a really good question. Possibly not. I don't know. I don't know offhand. I'd have to ask a question. But there's actually, if you take a look, we'll take a look at the bottom. We'll get to the footnote eventually. But he actually does mention that the question was asked about those bars of soap. Do the bars of soap constitute a problem? We'll get there. We'll talk about it. Anyways, we're on the bottom of page 35. A complete spinal column as well as a complete skull are able to generate the impurity through shared airspace. The Gemara questions whether the spine and the skull are metame as a group or each one alone is able to generate that impurity. And again, we're dealing with being in the same airspace and under the same roof as these body parts. The Gemara does not reach a conclusion. The Rambam, this is Maimonides, the Rambam says that either the skull or the spine is able to generate the impurity separately. The Sefer HaChinuch holds that both the skull and the spine are needed. So that's actually unusual because the Sefer HaChinuch usually decides in accordance with the Rambam. Very rarely he differs. But here you have an example of where he does so. If the skull is missing a piece the size of a Sela coin, it's considered incomplete and is therefore no longer able to generate an impurity. For most of these items, and we said when it comes to bones overall that are a kav, which is the measurement that we said before, then it can generate it even if it's been pulverized, broken up into a powder. We're talking here about things that are less than a kav. You can still generate that impurity if you have the majority of the body, the majority of the number, or a complete spinal column, or a complete skull. Should you be lacking that, then you would not have the impurity that was being generated. Now let's take a look on, if you turn to the to page 91, it's on the page with all the figures. We're looking at figure number 12. You'll see here that he included a picture. In figure 12, this skull is missing pieces larger than a k'dei makdeach, which is one of the prerequisite measurements, and is therefore not metame ba'ohel. We're on page 91 in figure number 12, and therefore it's not able to generate the impurity, assuming you don't have that quarter kav, that measure of bone. And he's telling you exactly where this picture comes from. And you can go to for example, many of the museums in Chicago and see skulls just like this in many places, human skulls. So again, bones are able to generate the impurity as long as you have the prerequisite measure. Less than the prerequisite measure if you have the majority of the body or the majority of the number, or you have particular important parts like the spinal column or the skull. If they're whole, they're still able to generate that impurity. Now, what happens if you are a phlebotomist? Is that what they're called? People who draw blood? What if you're a phlebotomist? Are you then, we just said before that if a person has a part of their body amputated, that body part is able to generate impurity. What about blood? We said before that blood is able to generate impurity, but what about blood that's drawn? What if a person works at a blood bank? What if, do these things generate impurity? And that's going to be our next topic. So we're going to turn back to page 36. Blood, a revi'is, which is a quarter lug. That's about 3.5, 4, perhaps as much as 6 to 8 ounces of blood from a live person does not generate impurity. Blood from live people does not generate impurity generally. However, that amount of blood, those few ounces that comes from a dead body is able to generate impurity. So if blood is drawn from a cadaver, that blood also could generate the impurity, even if it's bagged and removed from the location and brought someplace else. The revi'is, that measurement of those several ounces, must be from one corpse. Oh, I think I wrote it down at one point. I think a revi'is is 88 milliliters for those metric heads amongst you. Blood that exited a person while he was dying, sometime before and some after death, is known as dam tevusa. Such blood is only able to generate an impurity rabbinically, because some of it came before, is blood that can generate impurity, some of it is blood that cannot generate impurity. Generally, if you don't have the prerequisite amount, it won't generate the impurity. But here, in this case, where you have the same individual's blood that got mixed up together, that can generate an impurity midirabanan according to rabbinic law. It's a rabbinic edict, because just people get confused. Now, on the very top of page 37, teeth and hair. Any part of the body that one was not born with, for example, teeth, do not generate impurity at all. So if you think, for example, I don't know, did anybody here see Rambo? I saw Rambo once a long time ago when I was a kid, and I never, but I believe there was somebody in the movie had a necklace with ears of his victims. Ears would potentially be a problem, but teeth would probably not be an issue. But right, it wouldn't necessarily generate impurity. Also, anything that's removed, that if removed, will regenerate, also does not generate an impurity. This would, for example, be hair or nails or bodily refuse. However, these items are metame. They do generate an impurity when they're attached to the corpse, but when they're detached, they're no longer able to generate an impurity. So these items over here, so for example, if somebody collected hair to be turned into a wig from a dead body, that hair would not pose a problem, because hair grows back after it's cut. It's not the part of the body that's able to generate that impurity by simply sharing the airspace with the individual. All right. Now, getting into the discussion, I mentioned before, I spoke a little bit about cremation. A shovelful, what's called a mole tarvot of corpse dust, is able to generate tuma ba'ohel. It's able to generate an impurity through shared airspace by sharing a roof. Rekeb is the naturally occurring dust that remains from a single complete corpse that has no other substance mixed in. Such a circumstance is only possible if a body is buried, unclothed, in a sealed marble coffin. Generally, that doesn't normally happen. So it's a
We
right.
don't do that.
We don't do that exactly. A Kohen may be matame, meaning he may be may be matame to ashes of a burnt corpse. He basically says that he's saying that the ashes of cremation does not generate an impurity through shared air spaces, yet one should still avoid touching or moving such ashes because small bone fragments may remain. So again, holding up one's great Uncle George and handing it to their Kohen next door neighbor probably ought not to do that. And if you turn back to the pages with the figures, we're looking at figure number 13. So that would be again like page, what was it? Yeah, 91. Right. So he says, so here, cremains with visible bone fragments. It's on page 91, the middle image. You can see that that even after cremation, sometimes there are fragments of bone that still do remain. It's not entirely turned to ash. So a Kohen is allowed to be in the same room as that urn because we don't assume that they're the size that you have the prerequisite amounts and the prerequisite sizes, but the impurity can still be contracted through physical contact, right? So it doesn't generate the airspace impurity, but it does generate the impurity through physical contact. So while one can be in the same room, one should not sort of handle the urn. You'd be surprised how many times, how often these situations do come up.
Later.
You have stories too?
Oh, I was put up in a home, a guest home that had urns.
Uh-huh.
So
Okay.
I felt bad, so I moved them.
You know, people just don't, if you don't know better, you don't know better. Yeah, I think somebody is. Sean just asked a little while ago about how does one rectify impurity. You really can't rectify impurity nowadays. We're talking mostly about a Kohen's obligation to extricate themselves from being in contact. That's really the focus of the class. What are the Kohen's obligations? And these are the situations that a Kohen should sort of remove themselves from. But there really isn't any rectification. But even so, a Kohen's still not allowed to be in contact, even if they might be in a state of impurity already. A Kohen, because of their elevated status, has an obligation to sort of remove themselves from contact, even if there's no rectification. Maintaining contact is still problematic. But for a non-Kohen such as myself, as much as I don't want to be in contact with the deceased, if I can avoid it, that's just I have that modern 20th century ick factor, like all of us folks do. We come in contact with dead so rarely and so sparingly. We're not habituated to it. We have great sense. We haven't been desensitized. Rightly or wrongly, I'll leave the moral judgment to somebody else. As much as I would prefer not to be in contact with it, I have no restrictions on maintaining in contact with the deceased. Okay, now let's talk about the next part of here, the golel and the dofek. The golel and the dofek are two terms that are used in the Mishnah to describe some of the burial structures that used to be employed in a cemetery in ancient times. We don't generally do this too much any longer. In London, they actually did it on occasion, but we'll see. A golel and dofek are matami ba'ohel. If you are able to extend a roof over these portions of the structure that's built around a grave, they're able themselves to generate the impurity, even if the roof does not go over the body. As long as it goes over these structures, it's adequate. And we'll take a look at the figures in a section to see what it is. So these are the golel and the dofek. So there's a dispute amongst the Rishonim concerning the definition of a golel and a dofek, these two structures. Let's take a look at the figure, again on page 91, where you have an image here. It's a bit confusing, but you can take a look at the picture while I read, and perhaps we'll provide a bit of explanation there. So these at home can see the pictures are over here. I'll try to point to it as I read through it. Rashi states that the golel is the cover to the grave. So imagine that this thing over here is on the surface. The golel is the cover to the grave, and the wall and the dofek are the walls of the grave. Rabbeinu Tam says that the golel is actually a large stone that was used to mark the grave. That's similar to a tombstone or a grave marker, but it didn't stand up above, like just north of the head. Rather, it actually laid flat over the entirety of the grave and even extended further past the actual grave. And the dofek are the stones that are used to support it. Various halachic authorities cite the various opinions. Right. Even though the golel and the dofek, I'm on the bottom of page 38, even though the golel and dofek are metami, they're able to generate this impurity through shared shelter, their status regarding Kohanim, a Kohen, is subject to dispute. The Tur is of the opinion that a Kohen is forbidden midoraisa, biblically, from coming in contact with these structures around the grave, while the Rajba, that's Rabbi Shlomo ben Aderes, who lived in, I think it was Barcelona in the 13th century, he, however, understands that a Kohen is not obligated to distance himself from the Golel and the Dofek. The Beis Yosef, that's the Shulchan Aruch, he explains that although there may be no, makos, the person doesn't get any kind of punishment for such contact, a Kohen is still obligated to distance himself from these structures around the grave. The Shulchan Aruch says that a Kohen is required to avoid these golel and the dofek. So there's a big discussion of whether or not a Kohen definitely has to stay away from the actual body, itself. These sort of adjunct structures around the body, do they share the same stringency as the body itself? That's a matter of dispute. The practice is that we encourage a Kohen to extricate themselves and stay away to avoid the entire argument or discussion. Now, a goses. A goses is a very sick person who's close to death. In fact, they're about to expire. Besides the prohibition of a Kohen becoming tameh to a mace, besides the prohibition of a Kohen becoming impure through contact with the deceased, a Kohen may not place himself in a situation that may likely lead to him becoming impure. Therefore, a Kohen should not enter a building that houses one such individual, a person who's on their deathbed, whose expiration is imminent. The concern is that the goses will suddenly die, making the Kohen or exposing him to the impurity. The Ramah says that there are those who permit a Kohen to enter an area with the goses, though he adds that it is appropriate to be stringent. Many Achronim, which are contemporary authorities, rule that a Kohen is obligated to be stringent. If a Kohen is asleep in a room where a person becomes this goses, this person whose expiration is imminent but hasn't happened yet, all opinions agree that there is no need to wake the Kohen. We don't have to wake him because of what might happen. And the Kohen, if he is awoken up, he's allowed to if he's undressed, he's allowed to dress himself up properly. If you recall, that was something of a discussion. Does a Kohen just leave even in a state of undress, which was something that we discussed earlier. But in general, we say that a person should not put themselves in a situation where they will be exposed to impurity through sharing an airspace with someone who's about to expire. We're not talking about somebody who's in a hospice. A person who's in hospice can live a week, can live a month. My grandmother, she was suffering from cancer. She was brought to hospice, And after about 7, 8 months, they kicked her out because she just didn't die, and she continued to live for another 6 years.
Wow.
So I actually use that when I talk to people who like when they're in despair that a relative is going to hospice. I say, well, it's not necessarily the end. Just remember Bubby Sylvia.
But again, if you're the only person.
Yeah, then it becomes a mace mitzvah. Yeah, yes. If you're the only person, then it's a mace mitzvah. That's right. We're not talking about those situations. Yeah.
Coming back to cover my.
No, I know because you're a Kohen with a that has that beating heart that loves Klal Yisrael and you care. Yes. Yes. All right. Now, what about non-Jews? Now, there's an argument here. The Gemara quotes the opinion of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai that says the graves of non-Jews do not generate that airspace impurity. The Gemara quotes that even Eliyahu mentions the opinion of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai because there's a story about how Eliyahu was once encountered by one of the Tanoim or Amoraim, I don't recall offhand, who was it Amalek? Doesn't say. It doesn't say who it was, but he was once. But Rabbi Shimon Bar Eliyahu once appeared in a graveyard, and he was asked, "Hey, aren't you a Kohen? What are you doing here?" And he says, "Well, I hold like Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who says that non-Jewish cemeteries don't generate impurity." The Rambam says that while the halacha follows the opinion of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and that non-Jews do not generate that impurity, they do generate impurity. We can't leave this alone. They do generate an impurity. They just don't necessarily generate the airspace impurity that we're most concerned with. Right? They are, however, right. They do generate impurity through physical contact. Tosfos, however, says that the halacha is actually follows the opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, who says that that they do in fact generate impurity in their airspace. Most halachic authorities, they decide the halacha in accordance with the Rambam. Now, there is a massive argument here. There is many, many different opinions. And if you take a look at the overwhelming consensus, most halachic authorities side with the opinion that says that a non-Jewish grave does not generate that airspace impurity. There are three, however, who say that they do. One is Rabbeinu Tam, another is the Maharame Rottenberg, and the third is the Smag, the Sefer Mrs. Gedoza. I think this is Rabbi Moshe Mikutzi. What do all three of them have in common? Maharame Rottenberg, Rabbeinu Tam, Rabbi Yaakov of Dam. They're all German, right? They're all Ashkenazi. They're all Ashkenazim. And that's actually, so an Ashkenazi practice is to treat non-Jewish cemeteries with the same level of stringency. We do take greater leniency, so that's a bit of a misnomer, but we do consider their cemeteries to be as much of a concern as a Jewish cemetery, which is why, again, I keep going back to how there was a cemetery across the road and about a block to the south of Telz Yeshiva. There was the Bohemian cemetery that had great big trees that went over, that the Kohanic would go the long way around, or they'd walk on the other side of the road, even though this is a non-Jewish cemetery, because they were concerned for the impurity that is generated by having a shared structure or having a shared shelter, even for a non-Jew. Now, in some cases, when there's a reason for the Kohen to be there, we employ greater leniencies for a non-Jewish cemetery. But the Ashkenazi practice predominantly is to treat them with the same level of unless you have any reason not to treat them with the same level of stringency, and not to walk under trees that have boughs that go over the road, to be just as concerned. But the Shulchan Aruch says that while it's proper for the Kohen to avoid walking on non-Jewish graves, the Ramah also says that though there may be lenient opinions, it is correct to be stringent. The consensus of poskim, which are modern day ones, is that one should consider non-Jews to be metame ba'ohel and are able to generate that very same impurity.
So there's so much intermarriage.
Yeah.
How? You don't even know.
Right. So at one point, right, you have that. You also have Jews who sort of disassociate with the Jewish community and will be buried in secular or other kinds of other kind of cemeteries. Yeah. I mean, yes. I mean, Yes, that's definitely a concern. And the halachic authorities do discuss that. In the footnotes in the Hebrew, they do bring that as a legitimate concern as well. All things being equal, if you don't have all things being equal, we generally rely on the okay, it's called Komertzon. That's a dummy. Yeah, there is that consideration. It can definitely be a problem. Um, but we do treat a non-Jewish cemetery with the same level of stringency as a Jewish cemetery. All right. Well, we'll stop here. We'll continue next week. We're going to get into some of the more fun stuff, practical applications like airplanes, museums, and yeah,
So,
What about pets, Rabbi?
pets, animals. They generate an impurity, but they're not the kind of impurity that a Kohen is restricted from.